Number 1.
Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born in the spring of 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He grew up in what appeared to be a typical middle-class American family, but from an early age he struggled socially and emotionally. His parents' marriage was troubled, leading to frequent moves, and eventually their separation during his teenage years. As a shy boy, he found solace in collecting and dissecting animals, an interest that alarmed classmates and teachers alike, and hinted at deeper emotional disturbance. Despite his quiet demeanor, he struggled to form meaningful peer relationships and felt increasingly isolated from both family and community, a pattern that persisted into adulthood. As Dahmer entered young adulthood, he enlisted briefly in the United States Army, where he served as a medical specialist. During this period, there were later accounts from others suggesting troubling behavior and abuse, but these instances went uninvestigated at the time. After his discharge, Dahmer's life was marked by alcohol abuse and deepening loneliness, compounded by his struggles with identity and belonging as a gay man in a time and place where acceptance was limited. Over the course of more than a decade, from 1978 into 1991, Dahmer embarked on a series of crimes that would shock the nation. He targeted mostly young men whom he met in public spaces, such as bars, bus stops, or malls, offering money or companionship to persuade them to accompany him to private locations. Once there, he used drugs to incapacitate his victims before taking their lives and engaging in actions that reflected profound psychological disturbance. These offenses took place in various settings, including his apartment in Milwaukee and other sites tied to his daily routines. Although the full scope of his motivations remains the subject of investigation and psychological analysis, experts have noted that his actions involved a disturbing mix of control, isolation, and an attempt to forge permanence in relationships he felt unable to sustain in life. For years, Dahmer's pattern went undetected. It was not until the summer of 1991 that police discovered the extent of his crimes. On one night in late July, officers encountered a young man wandering near Dahmer's apartment, partially unclothed and visibly distressed. The man reported that he had escaped from inside a nearby residence, where he had been threatened with a weapon. When officers followed him to Dahmer's apartment, they found evidence that led to a broader search and eventual arrest. Inside, investigators uncovered photographs and belongings that pointed unmistakably to multiple victims and to repeated threats to human life occurring over many years. In the months that followed, Dahmer was charged with multiple counts of murder and related offenses. His trial drew intense media attention, partly because of the disturbing details of his actions, and partly because of the questions it raised about law enforcement's response to reports involving marginalized groups. At trial, Dahmer entered a plea that acknowledged his guilt, but also raised questions about his mental state. The jury ultimately found him legally sane, and in early 1992, he was sentenced to consecutive life terms in prison, without the possibility of parole for 16 separate offenses. While incarcerated at a correctional facility in Wisconsin, Dahmer's life behind bars was marked by continued controversy and isolation. He remained separated from the general population due to safety concerns and the nature of his crimes. On a late November morning in 1994, he was fatally attacked by a fellow inmate during a supervised work detail. He was 34 years old at the time of his death, bringing to an end the life of a man whose actions had become one of the most discussed and studied cases in modern criminal justice history. Psychologists and criminologists continue to analyze Dahmer's life and behavior, exploring factors such as early social withdrawal, unresolved identity struggles, and deeply rooted emotional disturbances. Diagnoses offered in professional assessments have ranged from personality disorders to ongoing debates over how neuropsychological and developmental influences contributed to his motives. His case remains a focal point in discussions about criminal behavior law enforcement protocols and the complex intersection of personal isolation and violent crime. Number 2. John Wayne Gacy, Jr. was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, the second child in a working-class family. As the only son of John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robeson, he grew up with two older sisters, and from early on his relationship with his father was strained. His father was an alcoholic and was reportedly verbally and physically abusive toward him, contributing to ongoing feelings of insecurity and conflict during his childhood. Many who knew Gacy described him as eager to please and keenly aware of how others perceived him, traits that later shaped both his public persona and the duplicity of his private life. During his youth, Gacy's social life was uneven. In school, he was competent but struggled socially, often feeling overshadowed by others. After high school, he briefly took a job in Las Vegas at a mortuary, an experience that reportedly involved emotionally unsettling moments. Back in Illinois, he married his first wife in the mid-1960s and went on to have 2 children. For a time, he appeared outwardly successful, managing several fast food franchises and positioning himself as a civic leader in local service clubs. Many neighbors described him as charismatic, community-oriented, and eager to be liked. But beneath the surface, Gacy struggled with conflicts related to his identity and impulses. In late 1968, he was arrested in Waterloo, Iowa, after allegations that he had assaulted a teenage boy. Gacy pleaded guilty to a charge of sodomy and was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, though he ultimately served only a portion of that sentence before being released on parole. This early conviction and imprisonment marked a significant turning point, ending his first marriage and driving him to rebuild his life back in the Chicago area. Over the course of the 1970s, Gacy ran a construction business and remained active in local politics and civic circles. He cultivated a reputation as a socially engaged man and even performed as Pogo the Clown at charity functions, parades, and children's parties. This role, at once lighthearted and surreal, would later become inextricably linked to his criminal legacy. Between the early 1970s and late 1978, Gacy's life followed 2 sharply divergent paths. Publicly, he maintained an affable persona known to neighbors and colleagues as friendly and industrious. Privately, he developed a pattern of luring young men and boys to his home under the promise of work, entertainment, or companionship. Once inside, he overpowered his victims and killed them. Investigators later determined that at least 33 young men and teen boys were killed during this span. Many of the bodies were located beneath the crawl space of his suburban Norwood Park home, with others disposed of in nearby waterways, revealing a methodical pattern that spanned years without detection. His crimes began to unravel in late 1978, when a teenager named Robert Piest failed to return home after being seen speaking with Gacy at his workplace. Officers were alerted, and a search of Gacy's address followed. During this investigation, authorities uncovered remains that ultimately tied Gacy to dozens of murders. In late December of 1978, Gacy confessed to police to committing a series of killings dating back several years. In the ensuing trial, which was held in early 1980, prosecutors presented evidence of multiple murders and related offenses, including kidnapping and sexual assault. After deliberating, the jury found Gacy guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death under Illinois law and spent the next 14 years on death row while his appeals were processed. During this time, he maintained contact with psychologists and occasionally produced artwork, often featuring imagery related to his public clown performances. On May 10, 1994, at the age of 52, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at the Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. His case remains one of the most infamous in American criminal history, noted both for the scale of the crimes and the stark contrast between his dual public and private personas. Number 3. Dennis Andrew Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945, in the small town of Strichen in northeastern Scotland. He grew up as the middle child in a family of 6, but he struggled early with emotional connection and self-understanding. From adolescence, Nilsen realized he was attracted to other men, a discovery that initially caused internal conflict and shame in an era and environment where open discussion of sexual orientation was limited and often stigmatized. As a young man, he lacked close friendships and kept much of his inner life private, a pattern that would later shape both his public persona and the darker aspects of his behavior. After finishing school, Nilsen joined the British Army, where he served as a private in the Royal Fusiliers, and later developed a routine of heavy drinking to cope with social anxiety and self-doubt. He later joined the Metropolitan Police in London, seeing in that career a structured way to belong to society, though he eventually left the force in pursuit of other work. By the mid-1970s, he was settled in London with a steady job, and outwardly appeared to be an ordinary civil servant, supportive of others, and polite to colleagues. However, beneath this public facade, Nilsen experienced profound loneliness and emotional turbulence. He struggled with rejection, unfulfilled desires for intimacy, and an enduring sense that meaningful human connection was out of reach. These psychological pressures intensified with isolation and alcohol use, creating a situation in which the boundaries between desire control and destructive impulses became blurred. Some psychological perspectives suggest that chronic isolation and internal distress can contribute to distorted coping mechanisms, though such theories do not excuse harmful actions. Between the late 1970s and early 1980s, Nilsen's internal world became tragically externalized. Operating from his residences in North London, he targeted primarily young men who were alone, often vulnerable and sometimes homeless, or with precarious living situations. He would engage them in conversation, offer food or drink, and invite them back to his home. Once there, he would overpower his guests, and they were killed by strangulation or drowning inside the residence. Afterward, he retained human remains in his living space for varying periods, sometimes interacting with them before later disposing of them away from public view. Investigators later determined he was responsible for a minimum of 12 murders, with some indications that the true number of victims may be closer to 15. For years, these acts went undetected. Law enforcement focus in London at the time was fragmented, and communication between units was not configured to quickly recognize a pattern involving missing persons who were often marginalized. Ultimately, it was a combination of practical circumstance and investigative diligence that brought Nilsen's crimes to light. In early 1983, a blocked drain in his Muswell Hill residence alarmed neighbors and property maintenance workers. When plumbers investigated, they discovered fragments that prompted a police report. Officers then entered Nilsen's home and found evidence that led to his arrest. Confronted with the facts, he gave a detailed confession that shocked investigators and the public alike. At his trial later that year, prosecutors presented the breadth of his admitted acts and attempts to kill others. The court found him guilty on multiple counts, and the judge sentenced him to life imprisonment. As part of the legal process, Nilsen made statements suggesting uncertainty about his motives, at times describing his own lack of clear explanations for why he had committed such acts. Despite being held fully accountable by the justice system, his words reflected the persistent psychological ambiguity that characterized much of his life. While incarcerated, Nilsen gave interviews and provided material that has since been studied by criminologists and psychologists seeking to better understand the interplay of identity isolation and deviant behavior. His case has contributed to broader discussions about how social marginalization and unmet emotional needs can intersect with violent conduct. Dennis Andrew Nilsen remained in prison until his death in the spring of 2018 at the age of 72. Number 4. Aileen Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. Her early years were marked by instability and loss. Her parents were in their teens when she was born and separated before she could form any meaningful connection with either of them. When she was a young child, she and her older brother were left in the care of their maternal grandparents after their mother abandoned them. Life with her grandparents was difficult. Her grandfather struggled with alcoholism, and her childhood included reported abuse and early sexual experiences that left deep emotional scars. These formative years shaped much of her later life, leaving her with unresolved trauma and a fragile sense of self. By her teens, Wuornos had left school and was living a transient life, often supporting herself through sex work. She became familiar with arrests for minor offenses, including disorderly conduct, drunk driving, and assault. During this period, she also experienced early motherhood, giving birth to a son at a young age and relinquishing him shortly thereafter. Her relationships were unstable, and she struggled to find a sense of belonging or security in her personal life. In the mid-'80s, she met Tyria Moore in a bar, and the two formed a romantic partnership that lasted several years. This relationship would become a defining element in her life, and later in the narrative of her crimes. Starting in late 1989, while Wuornos was living in Florida and engaged in street prostitution along the state's highways, a series of killings began that would draw national attention. During a period of roughly 1 year, she shot and killed 7 men she encountered in the course of her work. The victims were motorists, typically middle-aged men whom she met on or near the highways. Her life was a precarious balance between survival and despair. She later claimed that at least some of the killings were acts of self-defense, asserting that the men had assaulted or attempted to assault her. She maintained this narrative during portions of her trial, though prosecutors presented evidence contradicting those claims and suggested that financial motives and impulses toward control or retaliation were at play. The pattern of these events was one of transient encounters that ended in death, followed by the removal of property or vehicles from the scenes. Each incident took place in a different location in northern and central Florida, and the victims were not personally connected to Wuornos before they met. Her actions during and after these encounters reflected a deeply conflicted emotional state, one shaped by a lifetime of instability, perceived threats, and a pervasive mistrust of others. For some years, her activities went unnoticed by law enforcement, partly because the victims were not immediately linked, and partly because her transient lifestyle and the rural locations slowed investigative connections. Law enforcement attention intensified after July 1990, when an accident involving one of the victims' vehicles and a witness account led to police identifying Wuornos and Moore together. Fingerprint evidence on reported stolen items and other investigative leads soon pointed to Wuornos as a suspect in the deaths. On January 9, 1991, she was arrested at a biker bar in Volusia County, Florida, on an outstanding warrant related to a concealed weapon charge, though by this point, investigators already considered her connected to the murders. In subsequent interviews and legal proceedings, she provided detailed admissions of her involvement. Moore cooperated with authorities in exchange for immunity-giving testimony that supported prosecution of Wuornos. At a trial in 1992, Wuornos was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of 6 men. The body of a 7th victim was never found, and she was not formally charged in that case. Her defense introduced psychiatric evaluations that diagnosed her with borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder, observing long-standing emotional instability and patterns of trauma in her history. Despite these assessments, the court ruled her competent to stand trial, and she was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Wuornos spent nearly a decade on death row in Florida, during which time her case gained widespread media attention, inspired films and documentaries, and sparked ongoing debate about gender violence trauma and the criminal justice system. Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002, at Florida State Prison in Rayford, Florida, concluding her legal journey and leaving behind a complex legacy that continues to be discussed in true crime and psychological circles. Number 5. Andrew Philip Cunanan was born on August 31, 1969, in National City, California. At the time of his killing spree in 1997, he was 27 years old and had no steady occupation. Cunanan had lived intermittently as a gigolo and socialite, cultivating relationships with wealthy men in several American states. From early adulthood, he was socially adept and at times charismatic, moving easily within affluent circles in San Francisco's gay community, where he enjoyed the trappings of luxury and attention that seemed to elude him through conventional achievement. Despite his apparent confidence, those closest to him noted an instability beneath the surface. Cunanan often fabricated elements of his past, including claims about his family's wealth, and he struggled with rejection and feelings of inadequacy that persisted into adulthood. Cunanan's psychological and situational triggers have been the subject of extensive analysis and debate. He grew up in a large family, and though accounts of his early life vary, he exhibited a pattern of embellishing his biography and seeking approval through associations with affluent men. It is widely reported that he dropped out of the University of California, San Diego, and thereafter avoided conventional work, instead relying on relationships with older, financially stable men to support his lifestyle. Some accounts suggest that Cunanan felt deep envy and resentment toward those who succeeded socially and economically in ways he could not, particularly men who accepted his identity and offered stability interests or attention he longed for. His long-distance romantic relationship with architect David Madsen ended in the spring of 1996, leaving Cunanan emotionally wounded and reportedly feeling abandoned. In the spring of 1997, Cunanan's internal turmoil manifested outwardly in a violent spree that would span multiple states over approximately 3 months. The first known killing occurred in Minneapolis at the end of April, when Cunanan murdered his friend Jeffrey Trail, a former naval officer and acquaintance from the social circles Cunanan frequented. Shortly afterward, Cunanan murdered David Madsen near Rush City, Minnesota, a former romantic partner whose rejection had deeply affected him. From there, Cunanan continued east to Chicago, where he killed wealthy real estate developer Lee Miglin in early May. Miglin was not known to Cunanan prior to the encounter, but Cunanan's actions suggested a desperate irregularity that outpaced personal connection. In New Jersey, he then murdered William Reese, a cemetery caretaker whose pickup truck he stole, and used to continue his flight southward toward Florida. Cunanan's spree demonstrated a pattern of escalating risk and desperation as he traveled across the country evading law enforcement while leaving loosely connected clues in his wake. By mid-July 1997, Cunanan's crimes had drawn national attention, and he was added to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's list of 10 most wanted fugitives. Investigators linked him to the series of murders through physical evidence, stolen vehicles, and connections to his first victims. On July 15th, Cunanan traveled to Miami Beach, Florida, where fashion designer Gianni Versace was finishing a morning walk near his Ocean Drive mansion. Shortly thereafter, Cunanan fatally shot Versace on the steps of his home, a dramatic act that instantly amplified the nationwide search. Though the two men were not known to have a personal relationship, the murder of one of the world's most famous designers transformed the case into a global media event. Law enforcement intensified efforts to locate Cunanan. 8 days after Versace's death, on July 23, 1997, Cunanan was found on a houseboat in Miami Beach. He died by suicide there, using the same firearm linked to several of the murders. The manhunt and its culmination highlighted both the reach of federal investigative resources and the deep challenges in anticipating the actions of a fugitive on the run. Criminologists and psychologists studying Cunanan have explored motives that ranged from envy and a craving for validation to deeper emotional wounds tied to rejection and identity conflict. Although various theories suggest that Cunanan may have been driven by resentment toward those he felt embodied what he could not achieve, his precise psychological motivations remain inconclusive. He left no suicide note explaining his actions and his motives, including why he targeted particular individuals, and ultimately Versace, are still discussed in academic and investigative circles. Andrew Philip Cunanan's life ended on July 23, 1997, when he died by suicide on the houseboat in Miami Beach, Florida, concluding a cross-country killing spree that claimed 5 lives and riveted public attention on one of the most infamous manhunts in recent American history. Number 6. Randy Stephen Kraft was born on March 19, 1945, in Long Beach, California. At the time of his arrest in 1983, he was 38 years old and working as a computer consultant. To many around him in childhood and early adulthood, Kraft appeared quiet, intelligent, and capable. He excelled academically, enjoyed subjects like economics, and pursued higher education at Claremont College. Friends from school remembered him as helpful and thoughtful, a young man who enjoyed intellectual pursuits and carefully maintained the appearance of normalcy. In his early years, he participated in groups such as the Boy Scouts and other extracurricular activities, cultivating a reputation of someone grounded and familiar within his community. As Kraft transitioned into adulthood, aspects of his personal life became more complicated. He enlisted briefly in the United States Air Force after college, but his service ended early due to medical issues, circumstances that contemporaneous reports sometimes linked to challenges associated with his sexual orientation. After leaving the military, Kraft lived openly as a gay man at a time when societal acceptance remained limited. He held various bartending jobs in Long Beach's nightlife scene, frequented social venues, and built relationships within the local LGBT community. Despite the social connections he formed, those relationships and his inner world were marked by tension and instability beneath the surface. Observers later noted inconsistencies in his accounts of his own life and ambitions, suggesting a pattern of insecurity and an ongoing struggle with personal identity that many felt remained unresolved. Beginning in the early 1970s, Kraft's external life diverged sharply from the image he presented. Over the course of more than a decade, from approximately 1971 to 1983, he is believed to have killed at least 16 young men, although investigators suspected that the number of victims could be significantly higher. Many of the men he encountered were young, often hitchhikers or strangers he met in social settings, including gay bars or roadside locations reflecting the transient and vulnerable demographic he targeted. While the full extent of his actions remains uncertain, police found more than 60 entries in a coded list in his possession at the time of his arrest, which prosecutors referred to during the trial as a scorecard of presumed victims. This cryptic list played a central role in how the case became known in public discourse. Kraft's pattern involved offering rides, alcohol, or companionship before the deaths occurred, and over time, these acts left a scattered trail of evidence along the highways of California and in neighboring states. Authorities linked many of the discovered bodies, often found beside or near freeways, to Kraft through physical evidence, known encounters, and the entries in the scorecard, though many remain unidentified or connected only through cold case investigations. Despite these challenges, investigators were able to establish a timeline of disappearances and deaths associated with his movements across the West Coast. Kraft's arrest came in the early morning hours of May 14, 1983, when California Highway Patrol officers pulled him over on suspicion of impaired driving on a freeway in Mission Viejo. During the stop, officers discovered a deceased young man in the front passenger seat of Kraft's car, later identified as Terry Lee Gambrill, a Marine from a nearby base. A search of Kraft's vehicle revealed the coded scorecard photographs of unidentified young men and other evidence that connected him to multiple deaths, prompting homicide investigators to take custody of him. The ensuing trial lasted more than 1 year and became one of the most extensive in Orange County history. In May 1989, a jury found Kraft guilty of 16 counts of first-degree murder. A judge formally sentenced him to death later that year, reflecting the gravity of the convictions. The California Supreme Court upheld his death sentence in later appeals. Throughout his incarceration, Kraft maintained his innocence regarding the homicides for which he was convicted and those attributed to the scorecard. Randy Stephen Kraft remains on death row at the California Institution for Men, and as investigations continue, authorities periodically revisit potential unidentified victims that may be linked to his scorecard list from the 1970s and early 1980s. Number 7. Robert Andrew Berdella, Jr. was born on January 31, 1949, in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. At the time of his arrest in the spring of 1988, he was 39 years old and owned a small antiques and curiosity shop in Kansas City, Missouri, called Bob's Bazaar Bazaar. To neighbors and customers, he appeared unremarkable. A quiet, polite man with a keen eye for collectibles and a presence that blended into the city's eclectic Hyde Park neighborhood. Berdella's upbringing, however, was complicated by early emotional struggles and social isolation. In school, he wore thick glasses and was teased by peers, leaving him with few friends and a tendency toward withdrawal. His family was Catholic, but he left the church in his teens and never seemed to find stable community support outside his adult interests and business affairs. In his adult life, Berdella was known within local social circles as a gay man who frequented bars and places where young men congregated. He occasionally took lodgers in his home to supplement his modest income, and for a time he cultivated the image of someone offering a safe haven for those in need. Beneath this public persona, however, were signs of deep internal conflict and troubling patterns of behavior. Psychologists and investigators later noted that Berdella's social and emotional life was marked by insecurity, a need for control, and unresolved frustrations that manifested in unhealthy ways. He rarely formed close, stable relationships, and his emotional world seemed to revolve around a desire for dominance and an inability to tolerate vulnerability in others. While these tendencies did not explain his actions, they offered a backdrop to the dissent that followed. Between the early 1980s and his arrest in 1988, Berdella's private life took a dark turn. He encountered young men often through his social networks or in casual settings and invited them to stay at his home. Over time, this pattern shifted from casual hospitality to coercive control. Victims were isolated at his residence on Charlotte Street in Kansas City, and during periods of captivity, Berdella exerted dominance over them and documented interactions in personal logs and photographs. Although the precise motivations behind each encounter varied, investigators described a pattern in which Berdella sought to exert control and possessiveness over vulnerable individuals. Through these actions, he revealed a troubling psychological profile that combined elements of power, fantasy, and objectification of others. For years, a trail of disappearances and unanswered questions surrounded Berdella's property, but the cases did not immediately connect to him. Neighbors saw young men come and go from his house, and his reputation as a collector of curiosities and antiques masked the growing concern that something was amiss. The breakthrough came when a young man, held against his will, managed to escape from the second floor of Berdella's home in the early spring of 1988. Naked, except for a dog collar, he fled to a neighbor and raised alarm, prompting a police response that ultimately led officers to secure a search warrant for Berdella's residence. Inside, they found evidence confirming suspicions of prolonged captivity and unlawful deaths, including photographs and personal accounts the fugitive had described. Berdella was arrested that day and charged with multiple offenses related to murder-assault and sexual crimes. During court proceedings that followed later in 1988, Berdella entered guilty pleas to multiple counts of first- and second-degree murder, as well as related charges including selling illegal substances and assault. Prosecutors presented evidence of his documented patterns of control and interaction with the identified victims, and the judge sentenced him to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The trial drew attention from national media, both for the methodical way investigators linked evidence to Berdella's residence and for the insight it offered into how someone perceived as ordinary in public could be responsible for sustained harm in private. Families of the victims, many of whom were young men with limited social support, responded with a mixture of grief and relief at the resolution of the case. Criminal psychologists who studied Berdella's case noted that his motivations appeared rooted in a combination of sexual fantasies, a need for power, and long-standing emotional instability. Assessments suggested he derived a sense of control from the relationships he formed under coercive conditions, and that his documented records, both written and photographic, served as a way to impose meaning on those interactions. This psychological profile has been referenced in academic discussions about how underlying insecurities and unresolved trauma can become intertwined with harmful behavioral patterns when left unaddressed. Robert Andrew Berdella, Jr. died of a heart attack while serving his sentence at the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City, Missouri, on October 8, 1992, having spent just over 4 years incarcerated after his conviction. Number 8. Patrick Wayne Kearney was born on September 24, 1939, in East Los Angeles, California. At the time of his arrest in the summer of 1977, he was 37 years old and worked as a computer technician and electronics engineer after earlier service in the United States Air Force. to many who knew him in his neighborhood of Redondo Beach. Kearney appeared quiet, intelligent, and unremarkable, a man with steady employment, a modest social life, and a calm demeanor. In childhood, he was described as thin and physically frail, often the target of bullying. That early experience of mockery and isolation, coupled with inner conflicts about identity and relationships, shaped a withdrawn side of his personality that few outsiders fully understood. Kearney's psychological landscape was marked by a blend of emotional turbulence, unresolved insecurities, and evolving fantasies that took root in adolescence. He later acknowledged that as a teenager, he harbored violent thoughts toward people who had hurt or belittled him, and these early fantasies included imagined acts of dominance and control. Although such inner narratives do not translate directly to criminal behavior in Kearney's case, they intertwined with a developing pattern of seeking control in private encounters. As an adult living openly as a gay man, at a time when acceptance was limited, he found social connection through bars and informal networks. Within these circles, he sometimes leveraged his intelligence and fluency in Spanish to socialize in diverse communities, including in places such as San Diego and Tijuana, Mexico. Yet beneath the surface of routine social interaction lay a complex internal world that few around him perceived. Over the course of more than a decade from the early 1960s into the late 1970s, Kearney's internal conflicts manifested in a series of crimes that would eventually be linked to at least 21 murders, though he later claimed to have committed significantly more. His victims were predominantly young men and boys, and many were encountered in settings such as bus stops near highways or at social venues frequented by gay men. Kearney developed a consistent method. He would engage his victims in conversation, offering them a ride in his car, and then travel with them to more isolated locations. There, he would take their lives by shooting them, a method he later described as quick and efficient. Following the deaths, he often transported remains wrapped in heavy trash bags to locations across Southern California, including landfills, desert areas, and alongside remote stretches of state highways. Investigators came to refer to this pattern in the press as the trash bag murders, a descriptor that captured both the disposal method and the unsettling recurrence of discarded bags found along roadsides. At the time, law enforcement and media were also situating Kearney's crimes within a broader context of similar killings in California, sometimes grouped with others dubbed the freeway killers. However, differences in method and motive distinguished him from other perpetrators. While some of his counterparts were known for prolonged attacks or torture, Kearney's approach was described by investigators as more utilitarian in execution and focused on post-mortem control. Despite this grim pattern, many of his victims remained unidentified for years, leaving families and communities with unanswered questions long after their loved ones disappeared. Kearney's capture in early July of 1977 came after DNA and forensic evidence linked materials found on discarded items to locations connected with him. On July 1st, he and his live-in partner at the time, David Hill, walked into the Riverside County Sheriff's Office and identified themselves from wanted posters effectively surrendering to authorities. Hill was later cleared of involvement in the killings, but Kearney was immediately taken into custody. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he agreed to plead guilty to 21 counts of first-degree murder. Prosecutors and detectives were confident he was responsible for additional deaths, perhaps as many as 32 total, though physical evidence to support all claims was not available in every case. At sentencing, Kearney received 21 concurrent life terms, ensuring he would remain incarcerated for the remainder of his life. Criminologists and psychologists have examined Kearney's case for insight into how early trauma, social marginalization, and unaddressed psychological conflict can contribute to destructive behavioral patterns. His life sentence was imposed in December of 1977, and he is serving that sentence at Mule Creek State Prison in California with no possibility of release. Number 9. Ottis Elwood Toole was born on March 5, 1947, in Jacksonville, Florida. At the time of his arrest in the spring of 1983, he was 36 years old and living a highly unstable life as a vagrant and occasional sex worker. To the outside world, he had no fixed occupation and drifted frequently between states, often relying on odd jobs and the generosity of others to get by. His early life unfolded in a fractured household after his father abandoned the family when he was very young. Toole later described a childhood marked by neglect, persistent instability, and exposure to disturbing experiences within his family environment, including accounts of abuse and extreme religious influences that he reported shaped his relationship with intimacy and self-worth. These early influences contributed to profound psychological disturbance and a fragile sense of identity that endured throughout his life. In adolescence, Toole's life became defined by a series of emotional and behavioral struggles. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade and began engaging in petty crime, including arson, a pattern of behavior that escalated as he matured. He spent much of his youth on the margins of society, frequently sleeping in abandoned buildings, and found sporadic refuge in bars and social spaces that catered to gay men. Toole later acknowledged early sexual experiences with men, and in the mid-1970s, this aspect of his identity became entwined with his relationship with Henry Lee Lucas, a fellow drifter he met at a Jacksonville soup kitchen. The two developed a close bond that included a sexual relationship and shared itinerant lifestyle. Their relationship was both personal and criminal in nature, and it became central to the way both men's stories were later told by law enforcement and in media accounts. Over time, Toole's psychological profile revealed a man deeply troubled by unresolved trauma, substance dependency, and a pattern of destructive impulses. His sense of self-worth appeared to hinge on the validation of others, a dynamic that his partnership with Lucas amplified. Together, they drifted across states in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Both men made a series of confessions to law enforcement about involvement in violent crimes, though investigators later questioned the accuracy of many of these claims. Toole confessed that he and Lucas had committed more than 100 murders, though police were unable to corroborate most of these admissions, and have since assessed that many were exaggerated or influenced by the men's interactions with authorities. One confirmed incident that brought Toole into the criminal justice spotlight occurred in January of 1982, when he barricaded a 65-year-old man in a boarding house in Jacksonville and set the structure on fire. The man died of injuries sustained in the blaze after a week in care. Toole later explained to police that he and the victim had been involved in a personal relationship and had argued before the fire, an account that formed part of his arson conviction. In April of 1983, he was arrested on arson charges and received a sentence of 20 years in prison for that crime. Toole's case became further entangled with that of Henry Lee Lucas, who had been arrested separately. Lucas began confessing to numerous murders, some attributed to him alone, and others claimed to be shared with Toole. Law enforcement initially credited many of these confessions, though later investigations raised significant doubts about their veracity and the breadth of crimes each had committed. Among the most widely reported cases linked to Toole was the death of a young boy whose disappearance had drawn national attention. Decades after the fact, authorities announced evidence pointing to Toole's role, though debate about the case's details persisted among investigators and family members. During subsequent legal proceedings, Toole pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder in Florida, including those directly supported by physical evidence or consistent testimony. While some of his self-reported claims remained unverified, the convictions reflected a pattern of violent behavior linked to his life on the margins and his association with Lucas. Psychological assessments conducted while he was in custody suggested long-standing emotional disturbance, a lack of adaptive coping mechanisms, and a profound struggle with identity and attachment that permeated his interactions with others. Ottis Elwood Toole was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, and remained incarcerated at Florida State Prison until his death on September 15, 1996, from complications of cirrhosis of the liver. Number 10. Richard Westall Rogers, Jr. was born on June 16, 1950 in Plymouth, Massachusetts. At the time of his arrest on May 28, 2001, he was 50 to 51 years old and employed as a surgical nurse at Mount Sinai Medical Center in Manhattan, New York City. In the years before his crimes came to light, Rogers maintained a steady job caring for patients, including children, and was considered dependable by colleagues. Neighbors and acquaintances described him as quiet and polite, a gentle presence who blended unobtrusively into the diverse communities of New York. Despite the ordinary veneer of his professional and social life, deeper complexities in his personal story would later emerge as investigators pieced together a troubling pattern spanning more than a decade. Rogers grew up as the oldest of 5 children in a working-class family, learning traditional outdoor skills such as hunting and fishing from his father, who later relocated the family to Florida in pursuit of better work opportunities. As a youth, he was academically accomplished and engaged in languages, ultimately studying French at the University of Maine. Yet even in these early years, there were signs of internal conflict. While friends recalled a bright and thoughtful student, Rogers's temperament was often described as timid, and at least one violent incident in his youth resulted in a brief institutionalization. At the same time, he developed a personal identity as a gay man in an era when acceptance and support were limited, shaping a private life he kept largely separate from his professional persona. Between the late 1980s and early 1990s, Rogers became linked to a series of murders that would come to define his legacy in criminal history. Investigators later established that he targeted men he encountered at gay and bisexual piano bars in Manhattan, drawing them into his orbit before murdering them, and disposing of their bodies in garbage bags along highways in New Jersey. Many of his victims were older men, often visiting the city for professional or personal reasons, and at least 2 of the deaths, those of Thomas Richard Mulcahy and Anthony Edward Marrero, were confirmed in his later trial. The story of how Rogers's crimes were uncovered underscores the challenges law enforcement faced. In the early 1990s, the remains of at least 4 men were found in trash bags along roadways in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Initial investigative efforts did not link these discoveries to a single perpetrator, and the task force formed to address the pattern disbanded amid a lack of viable leads. Meanwhile, Rogers continued his work at the hospital, frequented late-night gay bars, such as the Townhouse in Midtown Manhattan, and maintained a discreet personal life in the city's queer social scene. As the decade progressed, the families of victims such as Peter Stickney Anderson and Thomas Mulcahy pressed authorities for answers. Their persistence kept the cases alive long after the initial investigation stalled, and in the late 1990s, advances in forensic technology offered a breakthrough. A technique known as vacuum metal deposition enabled investigators to enhance latent fingerprints on the garbage bags holding the remains, matching them to Rogers's prints from a decades-old arrest for an unrelated killing in Maine. On May 28, 2001, Rogers was approached by police during his shift at Mount Sinai under the pretense of a routine inquiry. Once identified as a suspect, he was taken into custody, and his home was searched for further evidence. In the ensuing legal proceedings, Rogers was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of hindering apprehension related to the confirmed New Jersey cases. During his trial, prosecutors presented evidence about the similarities in how the victims had been targeted and disposed of, and the jury found him guilty. The judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms, reflecting the gravity of the crimes and the pattern established by the evidence. Rogers has never publicly explained his actions or motives, and throughout the trial and his incarceration, he maintained his innocence. Criminologists and commentators have observed that Rogers's case unfolded against a backdrop of broader societal challenges for gay men in the 1980s and early 1990s, including heightened discrimination and violence that complicated both community safety and police responses to threats. The victims whose lives intersected with Rogers included men of varying backgrounds, professionals, fathers visitors to the city's queer nightlife, and their deaths prompted both grief and calls for improved investigative approaches over many years. Richard Westall Rogers, Jr. is serving his sentence at the New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, where he remains incarcerated under life terms without the possibility of release.